So this is a Com 101 quick tip about language, since we're talking about language this week and the importance of language. It seems like it would be so obvious in a public speaking class that language would be something we would focus on. But when you think about it, the majority of our communication, now that I've not got this thing working right, the majority of our communication is nonverbal. Remember, 7% of our communication is nonverbal, or 7% of our communication is the words, and 93% is nonverbal. So nonverbal has a huge impact in our everyday communication and even in public speaking. That's why we talked about nonverbal before. But language also becomes very important. We're one of the few species on Earth that has developed language. It allows us to convey things that happened, hundreds and thousands of years ago, that if we didn't have language, we'd have no way of conveying information, knowledge, all of that kind of stuff. But the other part of it that is important about language is we use language to define our social reality, and in fact, to define all of our realities. We talk about this a lot in Com 102. Everybody has their own slice of reality. So let's say, and this is especially adequate for what we're talking about on doing Zoom. I'm recording this. One person watches it, then another person watches it. They're watching the same thing, but they get very different information out of it for a whole ton of different reasons. And when they turn around to describe what they learned or what they saw, they will use very different language. And depending on how they took it in and what their perspective is, the language they choose will relay to the person that's listening to them how they felt about it. And it will also influence the listener on how they feel about it. So I always use a car crash as an example. Two people can be standing there and see a car crash, and they come and interview the first person and they say, oh my God, it was so bad. These two cars hit and it was loud and parts went everywhere and it was just awful. And then they go to the second person and they're like, man, it was amazing. These two cars hit and it was loud and it was parts went everywhere. It was so cool. I wish I could see it again. You almost wonder, did you two see the same thing? Because one thinks it's absolutely awful, the other thinks it's absolutely amazing. And they're choosing language to convey what they saw that shows how they feel about it. And by being the listener, if you're listening to the first person talk about it, you're going to feel like, wow, that was really bad. That was really terrible. But you will be influenced from the second person in, that might be kind of cool. That would be neat to see. We absorb some of the emotion, some of the energy of what the person who's speaking feels through the language that they use to describe it. So word selection is very important because words have meaning, as we all know, because all they are symbols for something else, right? But they also have direct meaning and inferred meaning. A lot of the meaning is how we use the words and how we say the words and where the inflection lies and all of that stuff. And so we will pick certain words, and there are industries that spend billions of dollars picking out the right words to get us to buy something or to vote for a candidate or to believe a certain thing or to get behind a certain change in society. The word choice becomes extremely important because words have positivity and negativity. You can pick one word to describe somebody and it'll seem like you're describing them in a good way. Let's say you describe somebody as being thrifty. That has a connotation, that word thrifty has a connotation of they're very good with using their money well. And so they don't waste money. They're very careful with it. And they're pretty good on finances. At the very same time, you could describe that person and say they're very cheap. And all of a sudden, the aura or the feeling around them changes just from going from thrifty to cheap, because cheap feels like, well, they won't spend money on good stuff, and they only buy the cheapest thing. And you know, it gives you a very different, more negative feel about someone just because of the words that we pick. And that's true in all of our conversations, in all of our messaging. And especially when you are in a speech situation, you convey, even an informative speech where you're supposed to be objective, you're still somewhat conveying your feelings by the words you choose to describe. Maybe you are pro on a certain position of a topic in informative speech, and all of your language is very pro towards that side. As an objective speaker, you've got to present the other side. So you present the other side, but you use language that presents it kind of as a worse option. You know, and we can convey that even in something like an informative speech, but it becomes really important when we're talking about persuasive speeches, because you are trying to persuade an audience to agree with you on whatever it is your topic may be. And so that language selection becomes very important. It's been used so many times over history, and people have been moved because of the way people used words. So how you use words, the words that you pick up, can greatly influence and affect the audience and how they feel about your particular topic. So I'm going to give you an example, and this goes back to around 2016. It was a topic that was brought up during the presidential election in the US, and the US has become very polarized in even its media. It used to, when I was a kid, it wasn't that way. There were laws in place that when the news brought a story, it had to bring it in an extremely objective level. They had to be very careful about the language they picked because they weren't allowed to sway an audience at all. Their job was to convey information and allow the audience to decide. Of course, in the 80s, a lot of deregulation happened, and the media now has become very polarized. So, you know, I could say right-wing media and people automatically know Fox News, for example, is a very right-leaning news organization. And I can say the liberal media, and people will think of, say, CNN as being more of a liberal leaning from a political standpoint anyway. And where that comes into play, and you see it almost every day in news, is in the way those particular organizations describe an event. So let's use Fox and CNN because they're on different ends of the political spectrum. There's an event happening, Fox reports on the event, CNN reports on the event, and you read the two. You can hear it on the TV news too, but it really stands out when you read it. You can read the two articles about the event, and the Fox article will be very much using terminology and wording that supports the right side of the political spectrum. CNN will use wording that supports the left side of this political spectrum. And sometimes you read the two articles and you're not even sure they're actually talking about the same event, and you know they are. And there's a couple of this is almost a sidetrack, but there's a couple of news websites out on the internet that actually will go pull stories from the far right and stories from the far left on the same topic and set them side by side, and then give you a middle of the road, because there are a few middle of the road news stories too. So you get a right, a middle, and a left article on the exact same event, and you can actually see this word selection thing in play. So the example I'm going to use goes back to 2016, and there was a group of people from South America and Central America making their way north to the US border of Texas. And the way the media described it was extremely different for the same exact group. So I'm not even going to say which side of the media it was. You'll figure this out on your own, just from the way the words are used. But one group of the media described this contingent of people as an immigrant caravan. And they chose those words very carefully. And it doesn't sound threatening. We've advertised, the United States has for 250 years advertised that we are a melting pot of the world. And, immigrants come here and then we melt their culture in with other people's culture and create the American culture. So immigrant is just a term for somebody who's migrating to the United States, right? And caravan, when I ask face-to-face classes, what do you think of with caravan? It's usually like a circus or a group of gypsies moving, or yesterday, one of my students said, it seems to me like there's a bit like a parade of hippies traveling. They're all groups of people that are migrating, but it doesn't sound threatening at all. And when they were referring to this group, the news organizations on one side of the spectrum would typically refer to them as an immigrant caravan. When you went to the other side of the political spectrum, they would describe them as an alien invasion. That's a very different feel than an immigrant caravan. An alien invasion, alien sounds like non-human when you think about it. I mean, War of the Worlds was about aliens from outer space coming and attacking the Earth, and the movie and the original radio program back in when that first came out, both portrayed aliens as something horrible and out to get us and take over the world, kill everybody. Alien by itself has a very negative connotation, and it also sort of implies not human. And then invasion, an invasion is very different than a caravan, right? An invasion sounds like you can just see this flood of people. For some reason, when I hear invasion, I think of the movie that Brad Pitt was in about zombies. I think it was World War Z, and all those zombies trying to climb the wall to invade into where they were going. That's what I think of when I think of invasion, and that's a very different feel. It's almost like, oh my God, we've got to get the army down there to protect us immediately from this alien invasion. And that was exactly the feel that they intended to create around this group of people. So same group of people moving up through to the southern border, described very differently, with the full intent of creating a certain feel on the person that was listening. So people who followed, this was obviously the left-leaning side of the media, people who followed this felt that it was a group of people who maybe had bad conditions at home, but they were trying to better their lives by coming to the country. And it was just, a long caravan of people. It wasn't threatening. Whereas the right side of the political spectrum media described it as an alien invasion because they wanted it stopped. They didn't belong here. They wanted action taken. And so their wording was set to fill you with that same kind of feeling that, oh my God, we're under attack. And so word choice really does matter. And that's why we pay attention to it in public speaking. When you're putting together your persuasive arguments, you need to think about picking the right word, because like you could pick cheap and thrifty to describe somebody. There are tons of comparison words like that. And you've got to think about what is the context of the word you're using? What is the implied meaning? Is there positivity or negativity to it? And does the word you pick truly convey the emotion and the meaning that you really mean to? And where are you trying to drive your audience? Because words really do matter. And we'll have more on quick tips about that later, but that's all I have for this particular quick tip. And I'll catch you later.